We all know about the Greeks: architecture, philosophy, literature. The very word music comes from Greek, as does so much else in contemporary culture. Greek poets and mathematicians and architects and philosophers founded a culture that we still identify with, and they introduced us to many ideas, from democracy to fart jokes. And the Greeks gave the West our first dedicated history. They gave us our vocabulary for talking about politics. Plus, they gifted us our idealization of democracy, which comes from the government they had in Athens.
Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green, did you say fart jokes?
When we think about the high point of Greek culture, exemplified by the Parthenon and the plays of Aeschylus, what we're really thinking about is Athens in the 4th century BCE, right after the Persian Wars. But Greece was way more than Athens. Greeks lived in city-states, which consisted of a city and its surrounding area. Most of these city-states featured at least some form of slavery, and in all of them, citizenship was limited to males. Sorry, ladies. Also, each of these city-states had its own form of government, ranging from very democratic, unless you were a woman or a slave, to completely dictatorial. And the people who lived in these cities considered themselves citizens of that city, not of anything that would ever be called Greece. At least until the Persian Wars. So between 490 and 480 BCE, the Persians made war on the Greek city-states. This was the war that featured the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 brave Spartans battled, if you believe Herodotus, 5 million Persians, and also the Battle of Marathon, which is a plain about 26.2 miles away from Athens. The whole war started because Athens supported those aforementioned Ionian Greeks when they were rebelling in Anatolia against the Persians. That made the Persian king Xerxes mad, so he led 2 major campaigns against the Athenians, and the Athenians enlisted the help of all the other Greek city-states. In the wake of that shared Greek victory, the Greeks began to see themselves as Greeks rather than as Spartans or Athenians or whatever. And then Athens emerged as the de facto capital of Greece and then got to experience a golden age, which is something that historians make up. But a lot of things did happen during the golden age, including the Parthenon, a temple that became a church and then a mosque and then an armory, until finally settling into its current gig as a ruin. You also had statesmen like Pericles, whose famous funeral oration brags about the golden democracy of Athens with rhetoric that wouldn't sound out of place today. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. And when you combine that high-minded rhetoric with the undeniable power and beauty of the art and philosophy that was created in ancient Athens, it's not hard to see it as the foundation of Western civilization. And if you buy into this, you have to be glad that the Greeks won the Persian Wars. But even if you put aside the slavery and other injustices in Greek society, there's still trouble. Do I have to say it? Seriously? Fine. Trouble, right here in River City with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for Peloponnese. Pericles' funeral oration comes from a later war, the Peloponnesian War, which was a 30-year conflict between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans did not embrace democracy, but instead embraced a kingship that functioned only because of a huge class of brutally mistreated slaves. But to be clear, the war was not about Athens trying to get Sparta to embrace democratic reform. Wars rarely are. It was about resources and power, and the Athenians were hardly saintly in all of this, as evidenced.
What we know about the Persians and their empire comes from an outsider writing about them, which is something we now call history. And one of the first true historians was Herodotus, whose famous book, The Persian Wars, talks about the Persians quite a bit. Now, the fact that Herodotus was Greek is important because it introduces us to the idea of historical bias, but more on that in a second. Did the right side win the Persian Wars? Most classicists and defenders of the Western tradition will tell you that of course we should be glad the Greeks won. After all, winning the Persian Wars set off the cultural flourishing that gave us the classical age, and plus, if the Persians had won with their monarchy, they might have strangled democracy in its crib and gave us more one-man rule. And that's possible, but as a counter to that argument, let's consider 3 things. First, it's worth remembering that life under the Persians was pretty good, and if you look at the last 5,000 years of human history, you'll find a lot more successful and stable empires than you will democracies. Second, life under the Athenians wasn't so awesome, particularly if you were a woman or a slave, and their government was notoriously corrupt. And ultimately, the Athenian government derived its power not from its citizens, but from the imperialist belief that might makes right. It's true that Athens gave us Socrates, but let me remind you, they also killed him. Well, I mean, they forced him to commit suicide. Whatever, Herodotus, you're not the only one here who can engage in historical bias. And lastly, under Persian rule, the Greeks might have avoided the Peloponnesian War, which ended up weakening the Greek city-states so much that Alexander, coming soon, the Great's father, was able to conquer all of them, and then there were a bunch of bloody wars with the Persians, and all kinds of horrible things, and Greece wouldn't glimpse democracy again for 2 millennia, all of which might have been avoided if they had just let themselves get beaten by the Persians. All of which forces us to return to the core question of human history. What's the point of being alive? I've got good news for you, Guy. You're only gonna have to worry about it for about 8 more seconds. Should we try to ensure the longest, healthiest, and most productive lives for humans? If so, it's easy to argue that Greece should have lost the Persian Wars. But perhaps lives are supposed to be lived in pursuit of some great ideal worth sacrificing endlessly for. And if so, maybe the glory of Athens still shines, however dimly. Those are the real questions of history. What's the point of being alive? How should we organize ourselves? What should we seek from this life? Those aren't easy questions, but we'll take another crack at them next week when we talk about the Buddha. I'll see you then.